Hi, Ted Morrissey here. Want to talk to you about a couple of stories in the Cold Embrace Weird Stories by Women, which is, of course, the text for our classic horror and sci-fi by women writers course in the Lindenwood MFA program. And specifically, we looked this past week at two pieces. Walnut Tree House by Mrs. J.H. Riddle, or Riddell, I'm not really sure how you say that, and In Dark New England Days by Sarah Orne Jewett, who, of course, is probably much more familiar to us because of her other work that's highly anthologized in American literature, books, and so on. So, gosh, there's just so much we could talk about in these two stories, and yet I want to make this not a terribly long video, so I'll have to kind of pick and choose here. But let me just kind of focus on Walnut Tree House first of all, and it was originally published in Riddle's 1882 collection, Weird Stories. She was much more inclined to write sort of supernatural tales, more so than Sarah Orne Jewett, who was more of a realist, a regional writer, and didn't oftentimes dabble in supernatural, although sometimes she did. But anyway, we'll look at Walnut Tree House, and I use this story as a example of how you could approach it by various from various critical perspectives, just to sort of model how one might do that. And again, there's just a lot going on here. It features a haunted house. In the last video I made, we talked about the Gothic setting, and this certainly fits in with that, very easily. A haunted mansion with a ghost boy who haunts it and so forth. And so, again, it clearly kind of plays with that tradition. Um, in fact, it almost, became kind of a stereotype. You've got the main character who has to spend the first night alone by himself in this haunted mansion, and it's famously haunted. The locals won't even step foot in the house. It's so haunted, and of course he has no way to light the lamps and so forth. So it's dark and eerie and all these kinds of things. And again, this idea of having to spend a night alone in a haunted house in the dark. I mean, that's been the stuff of countless stories and movies and so forth. Maybe we could take that stereotype, a stereotypical setting, and turn it on its ears somehow or another. But certainly, Riddle is playing with it in this very early story. Um, yeah, the idea that the ghost is a child, um, that also is something that a lot of writers have played with. There's something that's kind of uniquely creepy about children ghosts, or children who have supernatural encounters or whatever. I know I've referenced a few times Henry James's classic, The Turn of the Screw. And of course, if you're familiar with that story, it features two children, Miles and Flora, who are haunted by these ghosts. And, the narrator says specifically that one of the things that makes the story so eerie is the fact that it's children who are being haunted by ghosts and so forth. So I got to pause for just a second here. Okay, I'm back. So that's something to consider as writers. Are children ghosts, or ghosts haunted by children, particularly kind of disturbing and creepy to write about? I was just thinking about all of the different, stories and movies I'm familiar with where the protagonist is a child or a teenager. Um, and that certainly is very popular. I think of Ray Bradbury stories, in the science fiction realm especially, but of course Bradbury kind of occupied that gray area between sci-fi and horror oftentimes, and he frequently writes about children or teenage protagonists. Several of the pieces in the Martian Chronicles, for example, are children or young adult protagonists. And, something wicked this way comes, dandelion wine, and you can go on and on and on. And of course, I mentioned Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, more modern writers, I think, of the Hunger Games. If you want to get in kind of the sci-fi arena, in terms of focusing on young protagonists, with Cat, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's an interesting combination of putting a younger, even a child, into a sort of eerie, potentially dangerous situation. And it's something I've played with quite a bit in my fiction recently. By recently, I mean the last few years or whatever. Oftentimes I write about teenage protagonists and even, a little bit younger. And so, anyway, something to consider. Then in dark New England days, again, Sarah Orne Jewett, much more familiar to us probably because of short stories like The White Heron, which is just widely anthologized. I used to teach it in different contexts. I taught an American literature course at a college, and I think The White Heron was always part of the anthology, and I generally would put that on the reading list. And then I ended up teaching for the same college an introductory course on just women authors, not sci-fi and horror by women authors, but just women authors generally. And I believe I would generally include The White Heron in that reading list as well. But Sarah Orne Jewett in this, in Dark New England Days, also kind of plays with the idea of a ghost, although the haunting is almost more of a memory, of a traumatic memory kind of thing, more so than a out and out ghost as we kind of encounter in Walnut Treehouse. But still, this idea of the past haunting us is something that she's kind of playing with here. And we get several interesting features in this story. Some of us didn't care for the regional dialect, and it isn't something that we're terribly used to in modern prose. I'm sorry, excuse me again, just a second. Okay, it's kind of fallen out of fashion, uh, and and there was a time, though, when, of course, it was much more popular. We think again of Sarah Orne Jewett as a regionalist, and what that basically means is that she, in her case, that she lived in Maine, in New England region generally, and so her stories kind of come from there. And so the settings and then the dialect that she uses, and this was something that was particularly prominent at the kind of end of the 19th century, maybe just creeping into the 20th century a little bit. This idea of representing dialect probably grew in part out of the fact that with the connection and expansion of the railroad system in the country, kind of in the middle and then the final decades of the 1800s, the country was connected in ways that it hadn't been previously. This led to the establishment of national magazines instead of just regional magazines. So you could very quickly get a magazine from New York to California or Texas or somewhere like that, and vice versa. And so people were very interested about the way other people lived in other parts of the country, and that also included the way they spoke. And so a lot of writers, took advantage of that curiosity and tried to represent the way people spoke in different parts of the country, which of course was much more pronounced, and the differences were much more pronounced in that time period than they are now. We obviously can still recognize some regional dialectic differences in the U.S. New England versus Southern drawl versus maybe California or Minnesota, kind of Canadian influence to dialect, etc. But it's really gotten a kind of flattened over time because of people moving around, and especially with the internet age and being exposed to media and so forth. Again, people aren't as inclined to have really distinct dialects and unique vocabulary and so forth in different regions, but in this time period they did, and that was a curiosity. So a lot of writers took advantage of that and represented or tried to represent dialect as they were hearing it in their region. Kate Chopin does this with the Cajun dialect in a lot of her short stories and novels, from the New Orleans area. Obviously, Samuel Clemens famously does this sort of thing in his books, especially like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, which is from the same time period. And Sarah Orne Jewett is doing it here in Dark New England Days. Again, some of us found that particularly tricky to read and try to make sense of. And it's kind of fallen out of fashion now. We don't tend to represent dialect. We go, pretty standard, no matter where someone is from or what their educational level is. We tend to kind of represent their speech in a pretty, grammatically correct, way, with just a few subtle differences. I remember when I took workshop classes, a discussion that we had about using the word ain't and whether or not characters should say ain't. And what my mentor and eventual thesis director, Kent Hariff, his kind of rule of thumb was that if you wanted to establish the fact that a character was the sort of character who would say the word ain't, one time was enough. You could put ain't in there one time, and that would make your point, and then don't dwell on it after that, right? So don't fill up your text with ain'ts and other ungrammatical things. That just one example is enough to establish a character's you know, again, kind of education level and things like that. So I've kind of followed that my whole writing career. It seems to be a good rule of thumb, not to overdo it. Just a little bit goes a long ways. Um, but one of the things that both of these stories got me thinking about that I wanted to particularly kind of focus on in this video is the idea of ghosts, which obviously is not unique. You can go back to the Bible and find examples of ghosts, including the Holy Ghost, of course, but other ghosts as well. And every culture has had some belief in ghosts. They may vary a little bit, from culture to culture to culture in terms of the way they're represented, and sometimes they're frightening things, and sometimes they're actually good things. Ghosts can bring good luck. Maybe we can think of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, which kind of gives us the full catalog in just three ghosts, from helpful to amusing to horrifying, right? So they can take different sorts of postures in fiction and obviously based on the cultures and so forth, but pretty ubiquitous ghosts are. So there's something about them that human beings are particularly interested in. Of course, the 19th century of spiritualism and the belief in the supernatural and seances and all that stuff. I mean, it's all very interesting, and maybe we'll talk more about that as kind of time goes by here. But I got to thinking about ghosts in a more modern sense. And what I mean by that is, with social media and modern technology, ghosts and ghosting have kind of taken on different sort of denotations and connotations. Obviously, we use ghosting as a verb. To ghost someone is to ignore their text messages and their emails and their phone calls and so forth. And then another kind of interesting phenomenon that's very, very modern is, what do we do with people's social media sites after they've passed away? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Do we take it down? Do we just kind of leave it up indefinitely? When when Facebook first came along, nobody really had thought about that, and Facebook didn't have any hard and fast policies about what to do in those cases. And of course, now they do have different options and things that you can do, and some people decide to leave the pages up as sort of memorials or whatever. But oftentimes we just don't know. I mean, I'll see people pop up in my Facebook feed who I know have passed away, but yet there they are, almost as if still living. In fact, I made that error. Again, this is in the earlier days of Facebook, but I had a former student pop up. It was their birthday, so I wished them happy birthday on Facebook. And then later in the day, I got a phone call, and it was this person's parents wanting me to know. They weren't upset or anything, but clearly from my post, I didn't know that their son had passed away, and so they just wanted to let me know, because he had been one of my favorite students. After 38 years, I have a lot of favorite students, but definitely he was in that category, and he liked me as a teacher, so we had kind of a bond there, and so they just wanted to let me know. But it was strange to think that in some ways he was sort of still haunting my Facebook feed, and now that's a fairly regular thing. So anyway, I got to thinking, as writers, is there anything we can do with that in terms of the way someone can sort of live on, through their social media and so forth. I think about the fact that video, and YouTube and so forth has been around long enough that we can go and we can see video of people very easily, and that would be a very strange concept for people in earlier time periods. To think that they could go and look at a deceased relative or whatever, and watch their video and fully experience kind of what they were like and what they sounded like and what their personality was like and so forth. Again, earlier time periods that just wasn't possible. There are, it was kind of a tradition that if you had a baby and they didn't live very long and you hadn't had an opportunity to have their picture taken, or even earlier than that, their portrait made, that you would have someone kind of come in hastily and take a picture of them, or even paint a picture or sketch or something of them in their crib. They were deceased, but you would, in some cases, the painter or whatever would render them as if they were alive, or in some cases they just look like they're sleeping. But that was the only way that they would have to sort of get their likeness that they could then have, to put in a book, the family Bible, hang on the wall, put on the mantelpiece, whatever it might be. And of course, nowadays like I said, I mean, we have thousands and thousands of pictures and hours of video, probably, of people who have been deceased. And things happen so quickly. My dad passed away in 2011. I want to say, I was getting a little confused, but right around in there. And then my mom, not until 2020, just right before the pandemic and so forth, she passed away. But in just that decade, basically, even a little less than a decade, it changed in terms of how much social media we have. So in other words, I don't have any pictures or video of my dad, even though we visited them regularly. But I have lots of pictures of my mom and so forth. And so, in just that little time span, it got to be a more common thing to have, a bunch of family photos and video and things like that. Before that, it wasn't as easy, or it wasn't as common to do with your phone and that kind of thing. So, anyway, I've been thinking about that this morning as I thought about the fact both these stories deal with ghosts, one more overtly than the other, and then how that sort of fits into our sort of modern sensibilities about about sort of existing, an afterlife via social media, I guess, and what as writers we might be able to kind of do with that, and to play with that. And again, this idea of ghosting someone, what how might that be kind of fit into kind of a narrative, um, you know, plot or something like that. So anyway, I'll kind of stop there. I'd be interested to know what you think about all that. If you're familiar with writers who are kind of playing with the idea of existing in the afterworld in a social media sense, or whatever it might be. All right, so I will stop there and see you down the digital road.